For days, a billionaire father struggled to understand why his newborn son refused to eat. The baby was growing weaker, doctors had no answers, and everyone feared the worst. His fiancée, calm and supportive, suggested different formulas, new medications, and said the child was just adjusting. But the family maid, a woman grieving her own recent loss, felt deep in her heart that something wasn't right. She noticed strange behavior, watched from a distance, and suspected the truth no one else could see. Then one night, she sneaked into the nursery, and what happened next would change everything. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Margaret stood in front of the Cooper mansion, feeling a deep sadness in her chest. The house was large and beautiful, but to her, it felt cold and full of pain. Just 2 months earlier, she had lost her own baby, and the memory of that loss stayed with her every day. She worked as a maid for Richard Cooper, a very rich man whose wife had also died recently. His wife passed away during childbirth, and now he was left with a newborn baby who cried all the time. Margaret tried to focus on her work, but her heart was heavy. Every sound of the baby crying reminded her of her own child. Being around the baby made her feel both sad and protective. The house, once full of people, was now quiet and tense. Margaret felt like something wasn't right even though she couldn't explain it clearly. Her instincts told her that trouble was growing behind those walls. Richard Cooper had recently become engaged to a woman named Victoria. Since the engagement, Victoria had taken charge of the baby. At first, it seemed like she wanted to help, but Margaret started to notice strange things. The baby had stopped eating properly. He cried more and more each day. Margaret was very worried because the baby looked weak and tired. She remembered how her own baby used to eat and sleep, and this was very different. Whenever Margaret tried to help or even get close to the crib, Victoria would step in quickly. She always gave reasons for why Margaret shouldn't be near the baby. Sometimes she would say the baby was already sleeping or that he had just eaten, but Margaret didn't believe her. There was something odd about Victoria's eyes, cold, empty, and sharp. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and she didn't trust Victoria's words at all. Each day, Margaret's concern grew stronger. The baby's cries were softer now, but not in a good way. He seemed weaker, like he was losing his strength. Margaret tried to speak to Richard about it, but he didn't seem to notice anything strange. He was always busy with work or talking to Victoria. Margaret didn't want to sound like she was causing trouble, so she stayed quiet. Still, she watched everything. She noticed how Victoria acted when no one else was looking. Her smiles disappeared quickly when Richard turned his back. She seemed annoyed by the baby, and sometimes even angry. Margaret's heart hurt every time she saw the baby alone for too long. She couldn't sleep well at night because she kept thinking about him. Her instincts, the same ones she had when she was a mother, were telling her that the baby was in danger. But she didn't know what to do about it yet. Victoria continued to control every part of the baby's care. She fed him, bathed him, and put him to sleep. Margaret was never allowed to help anymore. This made Margaret feel useless and worried. The baby had stopped smiling. He didn't react to voices or toys like before. Margaret knew babies, and she knew this wasn't normal. She cleaned the house and did her chores, but her eyes were always on that nursery door. She thought maybe Victoria was hiding something. She tried to find chances to check on the baby when Victoria wasn't around, but it was hard. Victoria never left him alone, and if she did, the door was usually closed. Once, Margaret managed to peek in quickly, and what she saw made her feel even worse. The baby was lying still, with a pale face, and there was no bottle nearby. Margaret started to wonder if the baby was being neglected, or worse, hurt on purpose. Margaret remembered how she used to hold her own baby. She remembered the warmth, the tiny hands, the smell. Those memories made her feel more connected to Richard's baby. She didn't see him as just someone else's child anymore. He felt like her own in some way. Maybe it was the loss she went through, or maybe it was just the way the baby looked at her when their eyes met. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Every part of her was telling her to protect him. She thought about going to the police, but she didn't have any proof. What if they didn't believe her? What if she lost her job? Still, she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She started keeping notes of things she saw. She wrote down when the baby cried, when he was fed, and how Victoria acted. She was scared, but she knew she had to be ready in case something worse happened. Days passed and the situation didn't improve. Richard still didn't seem to notice anything wrong, and Victoria kept smiling in front of him. Margaret began to feel more and more alone. But even with no one on her side, she refused to give up. She found small ways to check on the baby, even if it was just for a second. She left toys nearby, hoping to hear him play. She listened for any sounds through the door. Sometimes she heard silence, and that scared her the most. Her heart raced every time Victoria walked by. She pretended to be busy, but inside, she was planning. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let this continue. She had already lost one child. She couldn't bear the thought of losing another, not when she had the chance to help. Her instincts had never been this strong before. Something was terribly wrong, and Margaret was the only one who saw it. For 5 long days, the Cooper baby had not been eating properly. Every feeding attempt ended with the baby refusing the bottle or spitting up what little he managed to take. His small body was growing weaker and he cried less now, which only made the silence more frightening. Richard was filled with fear and worry. He couldn't understand what was happening to his son. He had taken the baby to different pediatricians, hoping someone would have an answer, but none of them could find a medical reason for the baby's condition. They ran tests, changed formulas, and checked for allergies, but nothing worked. All the reports came back normal. Richard, who had already lost his wife, was terrified of losing his child too. Victoria stayed by his side, comforting him and pretending to share his fear. She spoke softly, gave him advice, and suggested new formulas and medicines to try. She always looked concerned, and her words seemed full of care. But Margaret started to notice things that didn't make sense. While Victoria appeared loving and involved around Richard, Margaret had a different view of what was really happening inside the house. She continued with her cleaning duties upstairs, but she kept an eye on everything. One day, as she was dusting a room down the hall, she saw Victoria walking toward the baby's nursery. There was something strange in the way Victoria moved, quiet, slow, and cautious. She held something small in her hand. Curious and uneasy, Margaret quietly followed. The nursery door was slightly open, and Margaret carefully stopped behind it, making sure she wasn't seen. She peered through the narrow opening and watched. Victoria entered the room alone and closed the curtains, dimming the light. Then she stood by the changing table and took out a baby bottle. From her pocket, she pulled out a small bottle with clear liquid inside. She opened it and added a few drops to the milk. Her hands moved quickly, but with care, as if she had done this before. Margaret's heart started to beat faster. Margaret stayed completely still, watching every detail. Victoria's face changed while she handled the bottle. Her eyes looked cold and empty. She didn't look like a concerned stepmother. She looked focused and distant. As she held the bottle, she whispered something under her breath. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but the tone sent chills through her body. Victoria didn't sound sad or gentle. She sounded serious, almost angry. After feeding the baby with the bottle, Victoria wiped everything clean and looked around the room. She seemed satisfied. Then, as quietly as she had come, she left the room and walked away. Margaret waited a few moments before stepping inside. Her hands were shaking, but she knew she had to act fast. She went to the changing table and found the small bottle Victoria had used. It was still there, sitting beside the wipes and creams. She picked it up and turned it in her hands, searching for a label. There was none. No writing, no brand, nothing. The liquid inside the small bottle was clear, like water, but Margaret knew it wasn't just water. Something inside her was screaming that this was the reason the baby had stopped eating. It explained the weakness, the silence, and the slow fading of energy. She held the bottle tightly and looked at the baby. He was lying in his crib, eyes half open, moving very little. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She thought about the days she had watched Victoria push her away from the nursery, always making excuses. It was all connected now. Margaret had no medical knowledge, but she didn't need a doctor to know that something was very wrong. She carefully put the bottle back in place, exactly how it had been. She didn't want Victoria to notice anything missing. Then she turned and left the room quietly, trying not to cry. Her heart was heavy. She had seen something terrible, and she didn't know what to do next. Margaret went back to cleaning, but her mind wasn't focused. She kept thinking about what she had seen. Her hands moved automatically, but her thoughts were full of questions. What was in that bottle? Why was Victoria adding it to the milk? And what were those words she had whispered? Margaret wanted to go to Richard right away, but she stopped herself. What would she say? She didn't have proof, just a strange bottle and a few seconds of watching from behind a door. Victoria was clever. She acted sweet and calm in front of Richard, and he trusted her. Margaret knew that if she said something without evidence, Victoria could turn the situation against her. She might even accuse Margaret of lying or trying to harm the baby herself. Margaret had to be careful, but she couldn't stay quiet for long. She knew she had to protect that baby. Every instinct told her that time was running out and that something much worse could happen if she didn't act soon. That night, Margaret stayed awake thinking about her next step. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the baby's tired face and Victoria's cold stare. She knew she couldn't let another day go by without doing something. The baby was getting weaker and no one else seemed to notice. Richard was too focused on medical solutions, too blinded by Victoria's calm words and fake worry. Margaret felt trapped. She thought about taking the small bottle and showing it to a doctor, but she feared being accused of stealing or interfering. Everything she did had to be done with care. Maybe she could find a way to test the liquid or take a picture of it. She didn't know yet, but she promised herself she would find a way. No matter what it took, she wasn't going to let that baby suffer alone. She had already lost her own child, and now she felt like this was her chance to save another. Margaret could no longer keep quiet. What she had seen with her own eyes haunted her every minute. The image of Victoria putting drops of that strange liquid into the baby's bottle stayed fresh in her mind. The baby was still weak, and no one else seemed to notice how serious the situation really was. Margaret knew she had to do something, even if it meant taking a risk. She waited for the right moment. When she found Victoria alone in the living room, carefully arranging expensive flowers in a vase, she took a deep breath and stepped closer. Her hands were shaking a little, and her voice wasn't strong, but she spoke clearly. She told Victoria that she had seen what happened in the nursery. She mentioned the clear liquid being added to the baby's bottle. Margaret didn't scream or cry. She just explained what she saw, hoping Victoria would finally drop the act, or at least admit something. But the response she got was very different from what she expected. As soon as Victoria heard the accusation, her face changed completely. The fake smile disappeared, and her expression turned cold and sharp. She didn't deny it right away. Instead, she stared at Margaret for a few seconds, as if trying to decide how to react. Then suddenly she laughed, a short, dry laugh, and shook her head. In a calm but cutting voice, She told Margaret that she must be imagining things. She said that Margaret was probably still confused and emotionally unstable from the loss of her own child. She accused her of mixing reality with grief. Margaret stood still, shocked by how easily Victoria turned the situation around. Before she could respond, Victoria called out loudly for Richard. When he arrived, looking tired and worried, Victoria rushed to him and acted as if she were the one under attack. She told him that Margaret was making false accusations and that it was probably caused by jealousy and sadness over not having a child of her own anymore. Victoria's performance was full of emotion. She spoke with wide eyes and a shaky voice, pretending to be hurt and confused. She told Richard that she'd always tried to be kind to Margaret, but now she was afraid. She said Margaret was seeing things that weren't real and making dangerous claims. Margaret tried to explain herself, but Richard raised his hand gently, asking her to be quiet. He looked at her with tired eyes. It was clear that he was exhausted, not just from the stress of the baby's health, but also from everything else happening in his life. He trusted Victoria. She had been by his side, offering comfort and solutions, and he believed her words. He didn't yell, but his words were strong. He told Margaret that he couldn't tolerate such behavior in his house. He said he understood that she was still in pain from her loss, but making up stories like this was not acceptable. Margaret felt like the floor had dropped beneath her feet. Victoria stood close to Richard, holding his arm and looking like the perfect caring fiancée. Then she demanded that Margaret be fired immediately. She said she no longer felt safe having Margaret in the house, especially near the baby. Richard didn't answer her right away. He seemed unsure for a moment. He looked at Margaret again, and for a brief second there was a flash of pity in his eyes. He remembered what she had gone through. He knew she had been working in the house for a long time, always doing her job quietly. Maybe part of him didn't believe she could lie like that. But still, the situation was tense. In the end, he decided not to fire her. He told Victoria that while he understood her concerns, it wouldn't be right to let Margaret go without proof. Instead, he made a decision that would change everything for Margaret. He said she could stay in the house and keep her job. But from that moment on, she was not allowed anywhere near the baby's room. The words hit Margaret hard. She didn't say anything. She just nodded and walked away slowly. Her mind was racing. She had done the right thing. She had told the truth, and yet she was being treated like the one at fault. She felt helpless. She had no proof, only her own word. Victoria had played her role so well, and Richard had believed it. Margaret felt the weight of everything at once. The loss of her child, the fear for the baby upstairs, and now the punishment of being kept away from the one person in the house who needed her the most. She didn't even get the chance to show the bottle or explain everything in detail. Her voice had been silenced too quickly. Now she was stuck. She still lived in the house, but her access was limited. She would have to find a new way to protect the baby without being caught and without getting close to him. That thought filled her with sadness and fear. Back in her small room, Margaret sat on her bed and tried to think. She looked around at the simple walls, the quiet space, and felt more alone than ever. She wasn't fired, but it didn't feel like she had won anything. She had just lost a part of her freedom. And the baby, still sick, still getting weaker, was in danger. Margaret knew in her heart that she had seen the truth. Victoria wasn't who she pretended to be. Something was very wrong, and now Margaret couldn't even step inside the nursery to check on him. She had no idea what Victoria would do next. The woman had shown how far she was willing to go to protect herself and keep control. Margaret had to be smarter now. She couldn't confront her again so easily. But she also couldn't stop. No matter how hard it got, she wouldn't walk away. The baby meant something to her. She felt connected to him. And even if no one else believed her, she knew she had to keep trying. 3 days passed slowly inside the Cooper mansion, and with each hour the baby's condition became worse. His small body looked weaker, and his cries were faint and rare. Richard watched helplessly as doctors came and went, all showing serious concern. After examining the baby, they suggested immediate hospital care, explaining that the lack of proper nutrition was dangerous. Richard listened in silence, clearly afraid. Before he could agree, Victoria stepped in. She argued that a hospital stay would be traumatic for such a young child. She spoke firmly, saying the unfamiliar place and people would only cause more harm. Her tone sounded confident and caring, and Richard, already exhausted, hesitated. He did not want to cause more suffering to his son. The decision was delayed, and the baby stayed in the house. Margaret observed everything from afar. She said nothing, respecting the order to stay away, but inside her chest, fear grew stronger with every passing moment there always. Margaret followed her routine carefully, cleaning rooms and corridors while keeping her distance from the nursery. Even without seeing the baby, she felt deeply connected to him. Her body still produced milk, a painful reminder of the child she had lost only months before. Every morning, the discomfort reminded her of what she no longer had, and why the baby upstairs mattered so much to her. She often had to stop and breathe, fighting tears while she worked. The rule forbidding her from approaching the baby weighed heavily on her. Still, she watched quietly, listening for sounds, watching doors open and close. Victoria moved through the house with calm confidence, always appearing in control. To Margaret, that calm felt wrong. It did not match the seriousness of the baby's condition. Margaret's instincts refused to rest. Something inside her insisted that the danger had not passed, and that the worst was still unfolding inside the house at that moment, quietly waiting. On one quiet afternoon, Margaret was cleaning the hallway near the living area. She moved slowly, careful not to draw attention. As she wiped the shelves, she heard Victoria's voice coming from another room. Victoria was on the phone, speaking in a low tone. Margaret froze and listened without moving. The conversation sounded serious. She could not hear everything clearly, but certain words stood out sharply. Victoria mentioned inheritance and a will, speaking as if these topics were very important to her. Then she spoke about time, asking questions about how long a small child could survive without proper feeding. Margaret felt her heart race. The words did not sound like concern. They sounded planned and cold. Margaret stayed hidden, afraid of being seen. Every sentence she caught made her more certain that what she feared was real. Her breathing became shallow as fear and clarity settled inside her, while she stood frozen in the hallway, listening in silence there. At that moment, all doubts disappeared from Margaret's mind. The strange liquid, the baby's weakness, and Victoria's behavior now fit together clearly. Margaret understood that Victoria was not confused or mistaken. She was acting with intention. The conversation confirmed her worst fear. Victoria was thinking about money, control, and what would happen if the baby did not survive. Margaret felt sick. Her hands trembled, and her legs felt weak. She leaned against the wall, trying to stay quiet. She knew she had discovered something terrible. This was no longer suspicion or instinct. It was certainty. The baby was not just sick, he was being slowly harmed on purpose. Margaret felt anger, fear, and sadness at the same time. The idea that someone could hurt a child for money made her feel cold inside. She also felt more alone than ever, standing there without help, while the danger continued to grow inside the house around her every day, in silence now. Margaret returned to her duties, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every movement in the house seemed heavy with meaning. She watched Victoria closely, noticing how calm she remained despite the baby's worsening condition. There was no panic, no urgency, only control. Margaret now understood the reason behind it. Victoria believed time was on her side. The thought made Margaret feel desperate. She wanted to scream, to run to Richard, and to force him to listen. But she remembered how easily Victoria had turned the situation before. One wrong move could cost her everything. She stayed quiet, hiding her fear behind routine work. Inside, her thoughts raced. She knew the baby's life was being measured in days, maybe hours. The doctors had already warned about the risks, and still Victoria blocked any help. Margaret felt trapped between the truth and her powerlessness, with no clear way to act without losing her position or making the situation even worse for the child. By the end of that day, Margaret no longer questioned what was happening. The phone call had removed any doubt left in her heart. Victoria was deliberately letting the baby starve to secure full access to Richard's fortune. As the child's fiancée, she would benefit if the baby was gone. This understanding filled Margaret with horror. She felt a deep sense of responsibility, even though she had no authority or permission to act. She stayed awake that night, listening to the quiet house, thinking about the fragile life upstairs. Every minute felt dangerous. Margaret knew that if nothing changed, the outcome would be tragic. The knowledge weighed heavily on her chest. She was surrounded by wealth and power, yet completely helpless. Still, one thing was clear in her mind. She could not pretend she didn't know the truth anymore, and that silence would make her part of the crime itself if she chose to look away and do nothing now. Margaret knew that suspicion was no longer enough. What she had heard and seen needed proof, something clear that could not be denied. The house was quiet late at night, and the lights were off. Everyone seemed to be asleep. Margaret waited, listening carefully, making sure no one was moving. Her heart was beating fast, but she felt she had no choice. She walked slowly through the hallway, careful with every step. The rule that kept her away from the baby no longer mattered to her. The child's life mattered more. When she entered the nursery, the sight broke her heart. The baby was lying still in the crib. His skin looked pale, his lips dry. His crying was weak, almost like he had no strength left. Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but she forced herself to focus. She leaned closer and saw clear signs of dehydration. This was not imagination. The baby was suffering badly, and time was running out fast. Margaret looked around the room, searching carefully. She remembered where she had seen Victoria place things before. Slowly, she opened the drawer of the small table next to the crib. Inside, she found the small bottle she had seen days earlier. The same clear liquid was inside. Her hands were shaking, but she knew this was what she needed. She took out her old cell phone. It was not a good phone, and the camera was weak, but it was all she had. She tried to take a picture quietly, hoping the sound would not be noticed. As she pressed the button, the flash suddenly turned on, filling the room with light for a brief moment. Margaret froze. She knew immediately that she had made a terrible mistake. The light had revealed everything. She turned toward the door, her heart pounding, already fearing what would happen next. She did not even have time to hide the phone or the bottle. The silence of the house was broken in an instant, and Margaret knew she had been discovered. Victoria appeared at the door, her face full of anger. She looked nothing like the calm woman she showed to Richard. Her eyes were sharp, and her voice was loud. She started screaming, calling out Richard's name. Margaret tried to speak, but no words came out. She was still standing beside the crib, holding the phone. Within seconds, Richard rushed into the room. He looked shocked and terrified. His eyes went straight to the baby, then to Margaret. Before Margaret could explain anything, Victoria moved quickly. She pointed at Margaret and began accusing her loudly. She said Margaret was trying to kidnap the baby or hurt him. She claimed Margaret had entered the room with bad intentions. Victoria pointed to the phone in Margaret's hand, saying it was proof of a criminal plan. She spoke fast and with emotion, making the situation look urgent and dangerous. Richard was overwhelmed, confused, and scared. The scene was too much for him to process clearly. Richard stepped forward. his face pale and tense. He looked at his son, then back at Margaret. His voice shook as he asked what she was doing there. Margaret tried to explain, but Victoria kept interrupting her, not letting her speak. She cried and shouted, saying Margaret was unstable and dangerous. Richard was already exhausted from days of fear about his child's health. Now he felt threatened inside his own home. He believed Victoria. The idea that someone could harm his baby pushed him to the edge. He told Margaret to step away from the crib immediately. He said he would call the police and let them handle the situation. His voice was full of anger and fear. Margaret felt helpless. She realized that everything she did to save the baby was now being used against her. The proof she tried to collect had turned into evidence against her instead. Margaret was taken away from the nursery and escorted to the back of the house. She did not resist. She was too shocked and tired. Richard ordered that she be locked in her small room while he decided what legal steps to take. The door was closed and the lock clicked loudly. Margaret was alone in the dark. Her phone was gone. The bottle was no longer in her hands. Everything she tried to do had failed. She sat on the bed, shaking, replaying the moment in her mind. She thought about the baby still upstairs, weak and helpless. She felt a deep pain in her chest, knowing she was now completely powerless. She had crossed the line to save a life, and now she was treated like a criminal. The fear of the police did not scare her as much as the thought of what would happen to the baby while she was locked away and silent. Inside that small room, time felt slow and heavy. Margaret listened to the distant sounds of the house, wondering what Richard was deciding. She knew Victoria would continue to control the situation. Margaret had risked everything and lost. Still, she did not regret trying. She had acted out of care and truth. Even locked away, she held on to one thought. The baby was innocent, and everything she did was to protect him. She feared that Richard's decision would come too late. The walls around her felt like a prison, but her mind stayed focused on the child. She prayed silently that someone would see the truth before it was too late. Margaret knew she might never get another chance. All she could do now was wait, hoping that the truth would somehow surface, even if she was no longer free to fight for it herself. Margaret knew that suspicion and fear were no longer enough. If she wanted to save the baby, she needed real proof. Something that could not be denied or explained away. That thought stayed in her mind all day and into the night. When the house finally became quiet and the lights went out, she made her decision. Her heart was beating fast as she walked through the dark hallway. She knew she was breaking Richard's order, but she also knew the baby might not survive much longer. Carefully, she opened the nursery door and stepped inside. The baby was lying in the crib, very still. His skin looked pale and his lips were dry. When he cried, the sound was weak and broken. Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay focused. She leaned closer and saw how thin and tired he looked. There was no doubt anymore. The baby was suffering badly and time was running out for him fast. Margaret began to look around the room quietly, careful not to make noise. She checked the table, the shelves, and then opened the small drawer of the nightstand. Inside, she found the small bottle she had seen before, the same one with the clear liquid. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. There was still no label, no name, nothing to explain what it was. This was what she needed. Proof. She took out her old phone, hoping to take a picture. The phone was slow, and she struggled for a moment. Then, without meaning to, the flash turned on. The sudden light filled the room. Margaret froze. Her heart dropped instantly. Before she could react, she heard footsteps and a sharp voice. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her face twisted with anger. She looked furious. She began shouting loudly, calling for Richard. Margaret stood there, holding the phone, unable to move, knowing everything was about to fall apart. Richard arrived within seconds, clearly alarmed by the noise. He saw Margaret standing next to the crib, the baby crying weakly and the phone in her hand. Victoria rushed toward him, speaking fast and loud. She accused Margaret of breaking into the nursery in the middle of the night. She said Margaret was trying to harm the baby or take him away. Her voice was full of panic and anger, and she pointed at the phone as proof. She said Margaret had bad intentions and was acting dangerously. Margaret tried to speak, to explain about the bottle and the liquid, but Richard did not listen. His face showed fear and confusion. He was already terrified for his son's life, and now he believed another threat had appeared. He shouted for Margaret to step away from the crib. His trust in Victoria was complete, and his fear made him blind to everything else. Victoria continued accusing Margaret, making the situation worse. She said Margaret had become unstable after losing her own baby. She claimed Margaret was obsessed and dangerous. She repeated that the phone proved she was planning something wrong. Richard's hands were shaking as he looked at his son. He was overwhelmed, scared, and angry. He said this could not be ignored. He threatened to call the police immediately. Margaret felt desperate. She begged him to listen, to look at the bottle, to understand what was really happening, but Richard only saw a woman in the nursery at night, holding a phone near his sick child. He could not think clearly anymore. Everything Victoria said made sense to him in that moment. He believed Margaret was a danger. His voice was cold as he ordered her to leave the room at once. Margaret felt her last chance slipping away. 2 staff members helped escort Margaret out of the nursery. She did not resist. She felt empty, shocked, and powerless. Richard ordered that she be locked in her small room at the back of the property. He said it was for everyone's safety until he decided what legal steps to take. The door was closed behind her, and the lock clicked loudly. Margaret stood still, staring at the wall. She had tried to do the right thing, and now she was being treated like a criminal. She sat on the bed, holding her hands together, trying to calm herself. She thought about the baby alone in that room with Victoria. Fear filled her chest. She had failed to protect him. The proof she tried to collect was now useless. Everything had turned against her. She felt trapped, both physically and emotionally, with no idea what would happen next. Alone in the locked room, Margaret's thoughts raced. She replayed everything in her mind, from the flash of the phone to Victoria's scream. She realized how carefully Victoria had planned everything. Margaret had walked straight into the trap. Now Richard was convinced she was dangerous, and the police might be called at any moment. But her biggest fear was not for herself, it was for the baby. She knew Victoria would feel even safer now. No one would question her actions anymore. Margaret pressed her hands against her face and cried silently. She felt broken, exhausted, and afraid. Yet deep inside, she still knew the truth. The baby was in danger, and she was the only one who knew why. Being locked away did not change that fact. Even in that dark room, Margaret refused to accept that this was the end. But for now, she was trapped, waiting for Richard's decision, while the life of an innocent child hung by a thread. The baby struggled to suck, but he was clearly feeding. That small movement was enough to make Margaret's heart race. She held him carefully in her arms, supporting his fragile body, afraid that any wrong move could hurt him. Tears ran down her face, without her noticing. She whispered soft words to calm him, repeating that everything would be okay. Her voice trembled, but she tried to sound steady. For the first time in many days, the baby showed signs of life. His lips moved with effort, and his breathing seemed slightly stronger. His skin, which had looked pale and dull, now had a faint trace of color returning. Margaret noticed these small changes and felt a deep sense of relief, mixed with fear. She knew this moment was important. She focused only on the baby, blocking out everything else. She did not hear footsteps in the hallway or the sound of the door opening. Her entire attention was on keeping the baby calm and feeding. hoping this small act could make a difference. Margaret continued to rock the baby slowly, staying quiet and alert. Her body reacted naturally, guided by instinct and pain from her recent loss. Holding him felt familiar and heartbreaking at the same time. The baby made weak sounds, but they were sounds of effort, not silence. That alone gave Margaret hope. She watched his face closely, checking every small reaction. She felt that she was doing what no one else had done in days, responding to what the baby truly needed. She did not think about rules or orders. In that moment, she thought only about keeping him alive. Her heart was full of emotion, but she stayed focused. The room was calm and the lights were still off. The quiet made her feel briefly safe. She did not realize how vulnerable she was. She did not notice how much time had passed. She did not hear the door until it was too late. The sudden change that followed would break that fragile calm completely. Without warning, the lights in the room turned on. The brightness filled the space instantly. Margaret froze, shocked by the sudden light and noise. She looked up and saw Victoria standing in the doorway. Richard was right behind her. Their faces showed very different reactions. Richard looked confused and unsure, trying to understand what he was seeing. Victoria, however, looked furious. Her eyes were wide and her body was tense. Margaret still held the baby, who was feeding weakly in her arms. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence felt heavy. Margaret's heart began to pound. She knew this scene could be misunderstood. She opened her mouth to explain, but Victoria did not give her the chance. The tension in the room grew fast. Margaret could feel that everything was about to explode. The baby shifted slightly in her arms, still feeding, unaware of the danger surrounding him. Margaret tightened her hold, afraid that shouting might scare him and make him stop again. Victoria suddenly broke the silence by screaming. Her voice was loud and uncontrolled. She pointed directly at Margaret, her hand shaking with anger. She accused Margaret of acting in a completely inappropriate way. She called her behavior criminal and dangerous. Her words came out fast, one after another, filling the room. Margaret tried to stay calm, but her body trembled. She looked at Richard, hoping he would understand. Instead, Richard looked overwhelmed, trying to process what he was hearing and seeing. Victoria continued shouting, walking further into the room. She said that everything finally made sense now. She claimed that the reason the baby had not been eating was because Margaret had been secretly feeding him. Her voice was full of false concern and rage. She made it sound like a shocking discovery. Margaret felt sick as she listened, realizing how quickly the situation was being twisted against her again. Victoria's accusations became even more dramatic. She claimed that Margaret's milk was contaminated and rotten. She said it was dangerous and harmful to the baby. She described Margaret as mentally disturbed, repeating those words loudly. She spoke as if she were protecting the baby from a serious threat. Her tone was theatrical and convincing. Margaret stood frozen, holding the baby close, afraid to move or speak. She knew any sudden movement could be used against her. Richard looked back and forth between them. His face showed confusion and fear. He did not know what to believe. Margaret wanted to tell him that the baby was finally feeding, that his color was improving, that this was the first positive sign in days. But Victoria's shouting drowned everything else out. The room felt hostile and unsafe. Margaret realized that once again, the truth was being buried under loud lies. The baby continued to suck weakly, unaware that his small moment of relief was turning into another disaster. Victoria kept talking, repeating her accusations with confidence. She described Margaret as obsessed and unstable, using her loss as proof of her claims. She pointed to the baby and said this was evidence of Margaret's dangerous behavior. Her voice echoed through the room. Margaret felt exposed and powerless. She did not try to interrupt anymore. She simply looked at Richard, her eyes full of tears, silently asking him to see the baby's condition for himself. She hoped he would notice the change in the baby's color and strength, but Victoria controlled the situation with her voice and presence. Margaret knew this moment was critical. Everything depended on how Richard interpreted what he was seeing. The baby remained in her arms, feeding with difficulty, but still feeding. That fact, simple and real, stood in sharp contrast to Victoria's words. Yet Margaret feared that truth alone would not be enough to protect either of them. Richard moved quickly, almost without thinking, and pulled the baby out of Margaret's arms. His movements were sharp, filled with tension, and his eyes didn't meet hers. Margaret froze for a moment, her arms still in the air, feeling the emptiness where the baby had just been. Her heart was beating fast. She had only wanted to help, to give the baby a chance to survive, but now everything was turning against her. Victoria stepped forward, her face filled with anger and fake shock. Her voice rose as she spoke, full of fake emotion and dramatic gestures. She accused Margaret of trying to replace her dead child with the Cooper baby. She said Margaret was mentally unstable, too damaged by grief to know right from wrong. Victoria told Richard that Margaret had clearly crossed the line. She demanded that he call the police immediately. Her words were loud and clear, aimed to control the moment and make sure everyone believed her version of the story. Margaret stood there, trying to speak, but her voice was shaky and uneven. She tried to explain what had really happened. She told them again about the strange bottle she had found. She mentioned the phone call she overheard, the one where Victoria talked about inheritance and how long a baby could survive without food. She said she had seen Victoria put something into the baby's bottle, but her words came out rushed, almost tripping over one another. It was hard to stay calm when everything was falling apart. Richard didn't respond right away. His eyes moved from Margaret to Victoria, then back again, but his expression was hard to read. He looked confused, overwhelmed, and unsure of what to believe. Meanwhile, Victoria kept talking loudly, taking control of the situation. She described Margaret's actions as dangerous and said they were proof of someone who had lost touch with reality. Her voice was calm in tone, but full of force. She made it sound like she was protecting the baby from a real threat. Richard's face turned serious. He looked at Margaret like she was someone he no longer recognized. He stepped forward, took her arm with a strong grip, and held her tightly. Margaret's eyes widened. She didn't expect him to react like this. She had hoped, deep down, that he might finally believe her, or at least question what was really going on. But he was no longer listening. The fear and confusion in the room were now being guided by Victoria's version of the story. Margaret tried again to explain. She said that all of this could be proven if they just checked the bottle, if someone simply looked inside the drawer where she had found the clear liquid. But Richard didn't move. He held her in place, silent, while Victoria took out her phone and began dialing. Margaret's chest tightened as she realized what was happening. They were calling the police, and they believed she was the one in the wrong. Margaret could feel herself losing control. Her voice grew louder, more desperate. She repeated that she was telling the truth. She said Victoria was dangerous, that she had tricked everyone. She begged Richard to look again, to open his eyes, but the more she spoke, the more she sounded like someone who was falling apart. Her breathing was uneven, her words came too fast, and her voice broke in the middle of sentences. Victoria looked at her with fake sympathy and said softly that this breakdown was exactly what she had feared. She told Richard this was proof that Margaret was mentally unwell. Margaret shouted that this was not a breakdown, it was the truth. But in that moment, no one was listening. Her voice, now raised and shaking, only made the situation look worse. What she said was true, but the way she said it only seemed to confirm what Victoria had been claiming all along. As Victoria spoke to the police on the phone, she gave them a calm and clear explanation of the situation, using words like unstable, dangerous, and unauthorized entry. She made it sound like she had just saved the baby from someone unwell. Richard stood quietly beside her, still holding Margaret's arm. He looked down, avoiding her eyes. Margaret stopped struggling for a moment and just looked at him. She couldn't believe how far this had gone. The pain in her chest wasn't just from fear, it was from betrayal. She had done everything she could to protect the baby. She had risked everything. And now, instead of being thanked or believed, she was being treated like a criminal. She begged them again to check the bottle, to test the liquid, to listen to her one last time. But Victoria shook her head and said there was no need. Everything was clear, and it was time to let the police handle it. Margaret felt her knees weaken as the weight of the moment settled in. She had lost. Victoria had won this round, using lies and fear to control everyone around her. Margaret's cries turned into whispers. She stopped yelling and just repeated quietly that the baby was in danger. Her words were softer now, almost like a prayer. Richard didn't say anything more. He stood still, waiting for the authorities to arrive. Margaret was no longer fighting. She was exhausted. Her body was shaking, not from fear, but from the sadness of being misunderstood and falsely accused. She had nothing left to give. She just hoped, somehow, some way, that the truth would come out before it was too late. The baby, still so small and weak, was the one who would suffer the most if no one acted. But for now, Margaret could only wait, surrounded by silence, with no one on her side. The police arrived in exactly 15 minutes. Their car stopped right in front of the Cooper mansion, and two uniformed officers quickly stepped out. Inside, Margaret was still being held by Richard. Her face was red, her hands trembling, and her voice had grown hoarse from repeating the same warnings over and over. She kept saying that Victoria was dangerous, that the baby was being poisoned, that someone needed to check the bottle. Her voice was loud and desperate, full of panic and urgency. But to those who didn't know the full story, it all sounded unstable. When the officers entered the house, they took one look at the scene and immediately moved to take control. They asked what was going on. Richard loosened his grip on Margaret and stepped back, still holding the baby tightly in his arms. The officers looked toward Victoria, who was standing just a few feet away, her expression perfectly controlled, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. Victoria spoke first, calm and composed. Her voice was smooth, but she sounded like someone deeply hurt. She told the officers that Margaret had been acting strangely for several days. She explained that Margaret had recently suffered the tragic loss of her own child, and since then, her behavior had become increasingly concerning. Victoria said she and Richard had tried to be patient, to give Margaret space and support, but things had gotten worse. She mentioned that Margaret had been warned multiple times to stay away from the baby, yet she continued to disobey. Victoria told the police that Margaret had broken into the nursery, tried to breastfeed the baby, and was now accusing her of poisoning him, all without a shred of proof. She handed over notes and messages from Richard, including the warning that Margaret was no longer allowed near the child. Her words painted a clear picture, a grieving woman who had lost touch with reality and was now putting the baby in danger. The officers nodded as they listened. They wrote things down and asked a few quiet questions. Margaret stood between them, her wrists now being held gently but firmly as one officer began reading her rights. She shook her head quickly and tried to speak. She said Victoria was lying. She said they had to look in the drawer, check the bottle, test the liquid. But the officers didn't react. They looked at her with polite, cautious expressions. To them, this wasn't a criminal uncovering a secret. This was a woman in a mental health crisis. Her words sounded like delusions. The more she spoke, the worse it looked. Her voice was high and uneven. She repeated things, circled back to the same points and pleaded with them to listen. One officer gently told her to calm down. The other officer brought out the handcuffs. As Margaret's hands were pulled behind her back, she tried one last time to make them understand. She screamed that the baby was going to die if someone didn't do something. Richard stood nearby, still holding his son, his expression full of stress and sadness. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't speak much during the scene. His eyes followed Margaret, and there were moments when it seemed like he might be doubting what was happening. But then he looked at Victoria, who moved closer to him, placing a soft hand on his back and giving him a small, careful nod. Richard looked down at the baby, who was resting against his chest, and then gave a weak confirmation to the police. He said Margaret had indeed broken the rules. He said he didn't want to press charges, but he agreed that she needed to be removed from the house for everyone's safety. It was clear that he believed Victoria, or at least he couldn't take the chance that she might be wrong. His fear for the baby's health was greater than his trust in Margaret's words. Victoria stayed close to Richard, her arms wrapping around him gently, one hand stroking the baby's back. Her face was wet with tears, but none of them looked real. She sniffled and looked down like she was trying to hide her emotion, but everything about her performance was perfect. She didn't speak again, letting Richard and the officers handle the rest. When Margaret was led outside, she didn't resist. Her body moved stiffly and her eyes were wide. She was still speaking, but her voice was softer now, almost like she was talking to herself. She said the same things, about the poison, about the phone call, about the plan, but no one answered her. One officer helped her into the police car, shutting the door behind her. From the back seat, she looked out through the window. Her face was pale. Her eyes were full of fear, not for herself, but for the child she had tried to save. She pressed her forehead against the glass and stared at the house. The Cooper mansion grew smaller as the car drove away. Margaret didn't cry. She just stared silently, her thoughts spinning. She had done everything she could. She had told the truth. She had risked her job, her freedom, even her reputation. And still, she had failed. No one had believed her. They had taken her warnings and turned them into proof of madness. She knew that Victoria had planned everything carefully. Every step had been calculated to destroy her credibility. Now, Victoria was free to continue whatever she had started, and there was no one left to stop her. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, her heart breaking. She thought about the baby, so small, so weak, and completely unprotected. She had seen a small sign of life earlier when she fed him, but that moment was gone now. She feared that without help, without real food, he wouldn't survive the night, and no one would ever know the truth until it was too late. At the police station, everything felt cold and rushed. Margaret was taken inside without anyone really listening to her. The officers followed procedure and began writing reports. They listed the charges clearly: trespassing, disobeying a direct order, and child abuse. Hearing those words felt unreal to Margaret. She kept trying to speak, explaining again about the bottle, the clear liquid, and the phone call she overheard. She said the baby was being harmed on purpose. But every time she spoke, the officers exchanged looks that showed doubt. To them, her story sounded exaggerated and confused. They saw a woman who had recently lost her child and was now making serious accusations without proof. No matter how hard she tried to explain, her words only seemed to confirm their belief that she was unstable. The more emotional she became, the less they listened. Eventually, they told her to stop talking and follow instructions. Margaret was photographed, fingerprinted, and asked basic questions. Her answers were honest, but her voice trembled. She looked exhausted, frightened, and desperate. That only made things worse. The officers remained professional but distant. None of them showed interest in checking the claims she made about Victoria. They focused only on what had happened inside the house that night. To them, the situation was simple. She had broken into a room she was forbidden to enter and touched a baby without permission. Everything else sounded like imagination. When she tried one last time to insist that the baby was in danger, an officer gently told her that she needed rest and medical help. Those words hurt deeply. Margaret realized she was completely alone. Her truth had no weight there. She was no longer seen as a worried caregiver, but as a problem that needed to be contained and controlled as quickly as possible. They led Margaret down a quiet hallway and placed her in a small, cold cell. The door closed with a heavy sound that echoed in her chest. The cell was empty, except for a bench and a concrete floor. The light above was harsh and stayed on. Margaret slowly sat down on the floor and pulled her knees close to her chest. The silence felt heavy. For the first time since everything started, there was nothing she could do, no one to warn, no one to protect. Her thoughts returned to the baby again and again. She pictured his pale face and the weak way he had sucked moments before being taken from her arms. She wondered if that small amount of milk had helped him at all. She prayed silently, asking that it would be enough to keep him alive just a little longer. That hope was the only thing she had left to hold on to. As she sat there, she felt wetness on her shirt. Her body was still producing milk. It soaked through the fabric of her uniform, leaving visible stains. That physical reminder of her loss and her failure made her chest ache. She pressed her arms tighter around herself, trying to stay warm. Tears came quietly, without sound. She didn't cry for herself. She cried for the baby alone in the mansion. She cried because she knew she had done the right thing and still lost. Her mind replayed every moment, searching for something she could have done differently. But each time, the ending stayed the same. She had been trapped by lies and power. Her instincts had been right from the beginning, yet no one had believed her. Now she was locked away, labeled dangerous, while the real danger remained free and unseen. Back at the Cooper mansion, everything felt calm on the surface. The house was quiet again. Victoria moved through the rooms with ease, her face relaxed. She felt victorious. The only person who had questioned her was gone. No one was watching her anymore. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Richard was exhausted and emotionally broken, focused only on the baby and trusting her completely. Victoria knew that nothing stood between her and Richard's full fortune now. The plan was working exactly as she intended. She walked into the nursery and looked at the baby sleeping in his crib. His breathing was a little stronger than before, likely because of the milk he had taken earlier. That small improvement did not worry her. She knew how to control the situation. She felt confident and untouchable. Victoria went to the drawer and took out the familiar small bottle. Her movements were calm and practiced. She began preparing the next dose of the appetite suppressant, just as she had done before. There was no fear on her face, no hesitation. She believed she was in complete control. The baby slept quietly, unaware of what was coming. The room was silent except for his breathing. Victoria glanced at him once more, then focused on the bottle in her hands. Everything was in place. Margaret was gone. The police believed her story. Richard trusted her. There were no obstacles left. What happened next would follow the same path she had already chosen. And far away, behind cold walls and locked doors, Margaret sat alone, praying that she was wrong, even though she knew she was not. Finally, we've reached the end of this story, and if you want to know how this story ends and how the maid will get her revenge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below if you want to see part 2 of this story. Until next time.